All right, thank you so much, Peggy. And thank you everyone for joining us today. It's really great to see so many of you that were interested in learning how to identify grasses. This just makes my heart so happy. We are waiting on some more people to join us, so I'm gonna maybe wait 1 or 2 minutes. We did have a change in our Zoom link because there were over 500 of you who wanted to sign up today. So because of that, we had to have some logistics change a little bit. So I'm gonna stall a little bit so we get some more people on here as well. Okay, and Peggy, if you're able to share the information for the call-in number, just in case we have some audio issues.
I did, and maybe it was stuck in the other meeting. Let me see if I can pull up our current chat here. It should be there. Do you see it? Oh, it's in the waiting room. Yep. Let's move that over to the everyone meeting. And hopefully then let's see if I can get it. There you go. It was there, just in the wrong room.
All right, perfect, awesome. So if at any time you do lose sound, just to cover that, what we recommend is that you just leave the meeting and then rejoin. Usually that fixes it most of the time. And then if not, try that call-in number. You can just still be have the slideshow up, but then just call in for that audio as well. And if you still have your video on, we ask that you please turn that off just so that it doesn't block the screen for people as we have pictures on the screen. Okay, I'm just gonna have mine on as I introduce myself, and then I'm gonna turn mine off as well. Okay, it seems like we still have some people joining us, but I'm going to go ahead and start with introducing myself, and then we'll go ahead and get into the presentation. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Erin Garrett, and I am an energy and environmental stewardship educator for University of Illinois Extension. And today we're going to start with an introduction to grass identification basics. So the goal of this session is to get you familiar with some grass terminology, as well as what characteristics to look for when you're identifying a grass, and where to find those characteristics on the grass. Okay, and then we're going to follow that today by diving into woodland grass identification. So we've got 2 sessions today, and then Wednesday, we're going to talk about prairie grass identification, and Friday, we're going to go into nuisance grass identification. So these are going to be our weedier grasses, okay? So just a little background on myself. I took an interest in identifying grasses about 6 years ago when I was an intern for the Nature Conservancy. And I was part of a grassland monitoring team, and we were assessing the impact of grassland restoration and management efforts in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And at that time, I was relatively new to plant identification in general. And here I was having to go out and survey these prairies and tell which grass was which when they weren't even flowering yet. So that was a big challenge. And over the course of that summer and a few other summers working with the Nature Conservancy, doing field surveys for my master's degree, throughout that time, I learned how to identify grasses, and I picked up a lot of tips and tricks for field identification. So that's really what we're going to focus on today, is things that you shouldn't need a hand lens for. You shouldn't need to bring things back to a lab to be able to figure out what grass we're looking at. So we're keeping it relatively basic today, and hopefully that will serve as a great introduction for you. So typically I hold this program in person, and we pass around grass samples and we take a hike to see grasses growing. But without that being possible, I still wanted to be able to bring some sort of education. So hopefully with a lot of great pictures, we're going to be able to get some semblance of that experience throughout this week. Hopefully you were also able to access a handout that I provided, and I apologize if the link was not working for you. I do have a different version of it that I can send out that hopefully works. But that handout contains most of the grasses that we're going to be covering throughout this week. And that is going to be kind of your takeaway from this presentation that has a lot of the information we're going to cover, so that you have that and can print it and keep it for your use in the future. Okay, we're going to cover about 55 grasses throughout the course of this week. By no means do I expect you to learn and remember all 55 of them. Hopefully maybe 10. Maybe you feel good about 10. okay? And I do know there were quite a few of us that registered from outside Illinois. So these grasses are Illinois grasses, but hopefully you can still take away some of the characteristics, and hopefully some of the other grasses can be found where you're located too. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so before we start diving into which grass is which, let's take a step back and look at what makes a grass a grass. So grasses are monocots, and monocots are a group of plants that can be identified because they have one cotyledon or seed leaf when they germinate, unlike dicots, which have two. So think of a radish that you plant. It has two seed leaves when it germinates. So in this picture, hopefully you can see that when grass seed germinates, it just has that single leaf, okay? Monocots also have parallel veins in their leaves. So when we look at blades of grass, we can see veins that run parallel versus more of a netted pattern or a pinnate feather type pattern like you would find in other leaves of other types of plants. Grasses do not have showy flowers, and this is the point that makes them so hard to identify. So this is a picture of big blue stem in full glorious bloom. I think it's striking and beautiful, but if you didn't know what it was, you might not even notice that it's flowering, okay? Grasses also have something called sheathing leaves. So what we typically think of as a leaf actually contains two parts. So I'm hoping you can see my cursor here. And we have a leaf here. And this leaf actually wraps around the stem and forms something called a sheath. And we'll look more closely at that as we continue as well. But sheathing leaves is something that you can use to identify a grass. Grasses also have hollow jointed stems. So if you were to cut a grass stem in half, it would be hollow. And it also has joints or nodes, okay? So you'll be able to find these swollen areas or bumps on the stem of the grass, and that is called a node, and it is another way that you can identify that you're looking at a grass. Okay, why do we start with that description? Well, there's a whole bunch of other grass-like plants called sedges and rushes. And typically when I have people come to my office and bring me a sample of a grass to identify, about 85% of the time it's actually a sedge. So we just want to point out that there are other groups of plants that look similar, but that are not actually grasses. So how do we distinguish them? There are some more technical definitions, but we're going to try to keep it simple. So for the most part, these definitions on the slide are going to hold true. But of course, plants don't always follow the rules, so there are definitely exceptions out there. So when it comes to rushes, their stems are not jointed or hollow. So if you were to cut the stem of a rush in half, you would find some sort of pithy tissue or plant material inside that stem. And they aren't going to have those nodes, okay? And rushes also typically have just a few or zero leaves on the stem. Sedges, on the other hand, their stems also are not jointed or hollow, and oftentimes their stems are triangular, but sometimes they can be round. So we don't want to hold true that sedges only have triangular edges, but many of them do. So that would mean if you were to roll the stem between your fingers, it should feel angled, okay? And because of that, the sedges that have triangular stems have 3 ranked leaves. So that means that their leaves come out from 3 points on the stem. And we can see that in this top picture here. We have 3 leaves coming out from a single point, okay? Don't ask me to identify what these sedges are. I am definitely not a sedge expert, but keep the picture of what these look like, because as we go through our grasses today, hopefully you'll start to pick up on and see that they look very different than our grasses, and we can be able to tell at least that it's a sedge, even if we don't know what type of sedge it is. Okay, So why do we want to know which grass is which? Hopefully you signed up for this webinar series because it's important to you to know which grass is which for some reason. So just like any other group of plants or organisms, there's a huge diversity of grasses, thousands of species across the world, and they don't all play the same role in our ecosystems. So in general, if we can have a higher number of native grasses, we don't know how the different elements of our environment use those grasses and how they can, benefit our soil or support insects. So the more diversity we can have of native species, the better off we're going to be. But it's also important that we know if we have native species or if we potentially have non-native grasses that can have detrimental effects. So in this picture here, this is a prairie restoration. And prairies are, typically dominated by grasses. So we may see this grass growing all over this prairie restoration and think we're doing a really great job. But the grass that we really would want to dominate in a prairie is this one over here on the left side of the screen. And we only see one, maybe two bunches of it here. This other grass is one called smooth brome, bromus and ermis. And this is a non-native species that, depending on where you're located, is treated as an invasive. So in this prairie restoration, they're dominated by this non-native grass. So knowing that and understanding that can help them determine their management actions to potentially, promote this good native grass, big blue stem over here, instead of this non-native grass that we have, okay? So we're already getting clues to why grasses are challenging to identify. Mainly, we talked about they don't have those showy flowers. The stem and leaves look similar across all species to the untrained eye, and often the identifying characteristics are microscopic details of the spikelets. And oftentimes this can, involve a lot of complex study and learning terminology. And that can just be really intimidating to the beginner, right? So for the most part, what we're going to do today is not going to involve using a hand lens. We're not really going to look that in depth at the spikelets, and spikelets are the flowering unit of the plant, okay? We're going to look for a few basic characteristics on them, but not really get that far in depth. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to look for simple but distinct characteristics of both the leaves and the inflorescences. Okay, an inflorescence is the flowering head of a grass. And we'll get a little bit more into these terms as we go through the next few slides. Okay, but we're going to look for those characteristics that we can identify if we're out in the field, and it will easily mark out these grasses. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to do when we're trying to identify a grass is look at what parts of the grass we have present, okay? If we have an inflorescence or that flowering head, we're going to start there. It's pretty much like coming up to a flowering plant and ignoring the flower. That's typically the best clue. That's where you'd want to start, right? So that's where we're going to start on a grass as well. Here we have two different examples of those flowering heads or inflorescences, and hopefully you can see that they look very different. So we're going to dive into how we can categorize them and tell the differences between these grasses, okay? And then if we just have leaves, we're not just going to look at green blades of grass, but we're going to see what characteristics are present on those leaves that we can use to help identify that grass. So you may not be able to see on this grass, but I'm going to outline that there's an M-shaped crimp in this leaf. And if you have a hunch that you know what species of grass you're looking at, and you know that it's supposed to have an M-shaped crimp, running your hand along this blade of grass to feel for that crimp can be a really great telltale sign. Okay, so let's take a step back now and start going over some terms. We're not going to get too far in depth in terms, but we do need to have a basis established before we move a little bit further, okay? So on the left, we have a sketch or a drawing of a whole grass specimen, okay? So up top, we have the inflorescence, that's that flowering unit. We'll look more closely at that in a little bit. First, we're going to start really basic, okay? What we think of as the stem of a grass is called a stem. You may also see the term culm. That may be used in, say, a dichotomous key that you're using. But for the most part, we're going to refer to it as the stem to keep it simple, okay? What we think of as a leaf actually consists of a few parts, okay? Our typical leaf structure is called the blade. And then remember, this leaf blade is going to wrap around the stem and form a sheath. Where the sheath ends on the stem, it's going to form that swelling or that joint that we can also call a node. Okay, so we have the stem, we have the blade and the sheath, and then the node where the sheath ends. Another term that you may hear is something called the collar or the collar region. And that is usually used to refer to this general area where the leaf blade joins the stem and forms the sheath, okay? So this collar region is where we're going to look for some important characteristics that we'll use in identifying grasses. And the first one we're going to look at is something called a ligule. So on this next page, I have some sketches of ligules. And the part of the grass we're looking at here, we've kind of blown up the drawings. So this part here is the leaf blade. So imagine the leaf blade going all the way up, and then it becomes the sheath here. Oops. So if we had a stem in this drawing, it would be going straight up the middle of this drawing. But for the purpose of the drawing, we removed the stem. And it'll become a little more clear when we look at actual pictures where the ligule is located. But ligules are a structure that can vary in type and color, and are also a really great clue to use when identifying a grass. So ligules can be hairy. So here we have a drawing of a ligule with short hairs. Over here, we have a ligule with very long, sparse hairs. But ligules don't have to be hairy. They can also be membranous. So looking like a piece of skin or a membrane, ligules can be short or they can be tall. But not all grasses have ligules. So if there isn't a ligule present, that's also a great clue. So let's look at some pictures. This will hopefully make it look a little bit easier. So here we have a very tall membranous ligule. So you can see what I've done is I've gently pulled that leaf blade back, and we can then really see that structure, that ligule, much clearer. So we have a tall membranous ligule in this photo. In our second photo, we have a short membranous ligule. And then in the third photo, we have a short membranous ligule, but note that it's not white anymore. And the ligule will often change color as the season progresses. So this is later in the season, late summer, the ligules turned kind of orange or brown or yellow. Those are typical colors that ligule will turn. Also note that there are some hairs, and we would say these hairs are located at the base of the leaf blade. So those hairs are not a ligule because we have that membranous ligule, but another characteristic to note on that grass. Okay, what do hairy ligules look like? Here we have a really densely, rather tall hairy ligule, and we also have some hairs on the leaf. Okay. Over here we have a shorter hairy ligule. And again, a hairy leaf blade. Those don't always go together, but in these photos they did. And in our last photo, we have a picture of a grass that doesn't have a ligule. So in this case, it just looks like an upside down raised, an upside down U raised surface, okay? And it would be smooth if you could feel that. Okay, there are a couple other characteristics that are much rarer. So if you find them, it's a great clue to narrow down what you're looking at least the grasses in Illinois. So auricles are an arm-like structure. And so in this drawing, these two arms would be the auricles, and they emerge from the base of the leaf blade, okay? And hopefully in this photo, you can see we have an auricle here, and these two down here might be harder to see. But if I pulled this leaf blade back, those arms would open up around the stem and you'd be able to see them quite clearly. Another structure, and I've only personally seen this on one grass, is something called horns. And these are an extension of the leaf sheath that form a U-shaped projection. So on this grass here, we can see this U-shaped horn. And this grass also has a ligule. See how that ligule is in between those horns, okay? This one is Indian grass. Indian grass has those horns. So if you find that characteristic, it is a wonderful clue that can help you right away identify what grass you're looking at. Okay, this is the quiz time. So we're gonna flood the chat box. Sorry, Peggy, if you're looking for questions. So we're gonna start with this arrow over here. What part of the grass is this arrow pointing to? Go ahead and put your answers in the chat box and we'll let that go for a few seconds. I see lots of them flooding in. Perfect. You guys are all experts already. Blade was correct. All right. Our next arrow is pointing at this structure right here. What do we call this structure? All right. Ligule is correct. Our third arrow is pointing at this structure, maybe the easiest one of the day. Ooh, we've got some of you that are given both answers, stem or culm. Yes, very good, stem or culm. Okay, and then this last one here refers to this part of the grass. Wonderful, that is the sheath, exactly. So if we refer to this entire area right here, that would be the collar region, okay? So the ligule can be found in the collar region. If we had auricles or those arms, they would be found in the collar region. You might find some sparse hairs at the base of the leaf blade. Sometimes that's referred to as in the collar region, okay? But very good, you guys are experts already. All right, let's look at some characteristics of leaves. So leaves can have hairs, they can have crimps, but just saying a leaf is hairy is not the best description because hairs can vary greatly. So in the case of this leaf blade, we have hairs, but you can see that they're only found on the margins or the edge of the leaf. And these are actually found on glands. So this is one example that we'll look at in a photo on the next slide. Leaf blades can be densely hairy and have lots of hairs on them. They can be sparsely hairy and have just a few. The hairs can be on the top of the leaf blade or the bottom of the leaf blade or both. And then we can have, remember, that M-shaped crimp or some other type of crimp or indentation on the leaf. And this is just general. There are other leaf characteristics as well, but we're trying to keep it simple, right? So let's look at what those hairs can look like. So here's an example of a leaf blade. We're looking at it from the side. It has hairs on both the bottom and the top of the blade. And you can see that those hairs are different lengths. So noting that it has short hairs on the bottom and long hairs on the top, that can be an important thing to be aware of. In our second picture, this grass blade has long hairs, but it's only on the top of the leaf blade. And this is the bottom of the leaf blade here, and we don't have any hairs. And then this one over here, it's a little bit harder to see because it was late in the season. But this is that grass that has those glands. You should hopefully be able to see these white to yellow colored dots and then sparse hairs coming off of those glands. Okay. Hairs aren't only restricted to leaves, though. We can find them on other structures of the grass. Oops. I'm going to click ahead accidentally. So we can find hairs along the stem. We can find hairs on the node. In this grass, the hairs are really velvety, and you can see that sheen there. So noting the consistency, the texture of the hairs, sometimes they're really coarse and stiff. Sometimes they're really velvety and soft. All of those characteristics are important to note too when you're trying to identify a grass, okay? On this grass on the right, it has these white hairs just around the nodes, okay? So again, a different example of how hairs can present themselves on a grass. Okay, and here are 3 that have some sort of indentation in the leaf. So we saw this one earlier. We have an M-shaped crimp. This one has a crimp that looks kind of like flames to me. Not necessarily an M-shaped crimp, but kind of 3 flames or waves. And then this one over here, a little bit harder to see, also an M-shaped crimp. So again, you might not be able to see them that well, but you would be able to feel them. But I also just want to put a note out there that this isn't necessarily the first characteristic you want to look for, because many grasses have very, very sharp leaf blades. So if you ran your fingers along them, it would cut you open like a paper cut. So these, we definitely want to look for some other clues first. And then if we think it's one of these grasses, and we'll cover all of these throughout this week, then we check that leaf blade for that crimp. So just putting that out there. I don't want you all getting paper cuts trying to find a crimp on leaf blades. Okay, so we're going to move on now to the inflorescence. And remember, this is the flowering head of the grass. And let's look at just a few terms. Instead of a stem, the main stem, I guess you would say, of the inflorescence is called the rachis. Okay, so it changes terms here. And then the main flowering unit is going to be called a spikelet. Okay, spikelets consist of many different parts. You may see terms like palea, lemma, glume. We're not going to get to that level in this webinar series. That requires a lot more terminology and a hand lens, and it's personally not something that I've dove into too much. So we're going to keep it pretty general, okay? If a spikelet is on a stalk, we're going to call it a pedicel, but I'm also going to call it a stalk throughout this presentation just to keep it simple, okay? The one characteristic that we can find on spikelets is something called an awn. And we're going to talk about awns because they come in many different shapes and sizes. But an awn is essentially some sort of, it looks like a bristle, but there is something else called a bristle. So we're going to distinguish between them. An awn is essentially like a bristle that is typically located off of the tip or the edge of the spikelet, okay? So here we have a whole bunch of different examples of what awns can look like. So this spikelet doesn't have an awn. Here we have a short awn, you know, a little bit longer, a little bit longer. This one is really cool and spirals as it dries. We'll see a picture of that one in a few slides. There can also be multiple awns from one spikelet, okay? This last drawing over here is depicting bristles, and bristles are typically found on our foxtails, and they're an external structure that's typically found at the base of the spikelet and is separate from the spikelet. So if you look close in the pictures that we're going to see, the awn looks like it's just connected directly into the awn, and there's not a clear necessary distinction where you could break it off. Bristles are a separate structure from the spikelet that it's very clear where that separation is, and it'll make more sense when we look at the pictures. Okay, so what do awns look like? Here on this Indian grass, we can see that each of those spikelets has an awn. Over here, we've got some shorter awns on these spikelets. And then over here, again, another example of awns. All right, in the leftmost picture, this is the awn that will spiral as it dries. And the purpose of this is to actually drill this spikelet into the ground. So you can see how pointed it is. And as this awn dries, it will drill that seed essentially into the ground and plant it. This is porcupine grass, very, very cool adaptation. Very difficult if you're collecting the seed and you don't separate it before it dries because it all twists together. Not that I'm speaking from experience or anything, right? This next one over here has 3 awns. This grass is actually called 3-awn, so that's a really great clue. And over here, we can see that these awns are curved. So not all awns are straight, some of them are curved. So again, looking at the length of the awns, the number of awns, if they're held straight, if they're curved, all of that will help us to distinguish these grasses. Okay, and here are those bristles. And what you can see in this picture is I broke off a piece of the inflorescence here, and we can see that these bristles, collection of bristles, are an external structure, and then the spikelet sits inside that, okay? So most of the time, awns will develop from the tip of the spikelet, not always, but most of the time, and bristles are typically surrounding on the bottom and separate structure than the spikelet. Okay. Let's talk about, and I gave something away on my slide. I apologize. Let me just put all this up here so it's not confusing. I had that random picture up. Okay, this is a lot of information, but we're going to break it down. Okay, so there are 3 main inflorescence types. Remember, that's the structure of the flowering head. Okay, and we can ask ourselves some simple questions to tell them apart. Okay, the first question we're going to ask is, does the main axis branch, or that rachis? Okay, if the rachis has branches on it, then we call it a panicle. Okay, so for the purposes of our discussion today, a panicle is an inflorescence whose main axis branches, and then the spikelets are either on a stalk or they're stalkless. So they have that pedicel or that stalk, or they don't have to have that pedicel or stalk. Okay, this depiction over here is the most typical version of a panicle that you will see. Typically, it's very branched, very airy, very open. It will be really distinctive once we see some examples. But this diagram next to it is also a panicle. We have our main axis, and these are each branches that have a spikelet that is not on a stalk or a pedicel. Okay. Moving on to the other half, if our main axis is unbranched, then either our spikelets are stalked or they're not stalked. So let's look at this one over here first. If we have an unbranched rachis and our spikelets are directly attached to that rachis, we have something called a spike. Okay, that name's pretty easy to remember. Typically, these just look like a spike. So again, main axis does not branch, spikelets are stalkless. And then the last one is the most difficult technical definition. And typically, this is kind of the catch-all, the raceme. So if we don't have a spike and we don't have a panicle, we have a raceme. But what we're looking for is a main axis that does not branch, and then spikelets or a collection of spikelets that are stalked. Now, I have seen some technical definitions that would categorize some things that we call a raceme as a specialized type of panicle. So this is not something that everyone agrees on. So you're free to put them in whichever one makes most sense to you. But how it's made sense to me is typically in a raceme, you'll find a lot of grasses that have these like long finger-like projections or collections of spikelets, okay? And usually this whole collection is on a little stalk. So I've kind of adjusted this definition so that our spikelets are stalked or that collection is on a stalk. Here we would also see that those collections are on a stalk. So let's look at some pictures because just from the drawings, it can be a little bit confusing, but hopefully this will make it a little less clear, a little more clear than mud. So here we have some panicles. Hopefully you can see open, airy, lots of branches. This one, you might not even be able to see the spikelets too well because there's so many branches. Okay, these are both panicles. On our next slide, this is also a panicle. This looks more like that second drawing of a panicle that we saw, okay? So we have branches and then spikelets that are not on stalks. And then the picture on the right, this is also a panicle, but it's a little bit more dense. It's not as open and airy as the last photos that we saw. Okay, so all four of those are panicles. Next, we have some spikes. So with spikes, we can find the spikelet, trace it down, and see that it attaches directly to that rachis. Okay, we don't have a stalk. Same on this side, we can follow our rachis and see that those spikelets are directly attached. All right, let's look at our catch-all category, our racemes. So here again, we have that central rachis. It's not branching, but we have a little stalk here, and then this collection of spikelets. Okay, same over here. We've got a few more of those fingers with lots of spikelets on them. And then in this one down here, we can clearly see that stalk with that collection. So again, if you want to look at more technical definitions that they have of different types of racemes and panicles, you know, it just depends on what source you look at, how they categorize it. But I found that this works pretty well for me. Again, this is big blue stem. We've got those long finger-like collections of spikelets, and we've got little stalks. This one over here is little blue stem, and this holds true to that technical definition of a raceme where we have a spikelet on a stalk and a spikelet on a stalk, okay? Hopefully that makes some sense. And as we go through our examples and learn specific grasses through repetition, I'm hoping we all get a good picture of those three different inflorescence types, okay? A couple other terms I just want to point out. They don't necessarily make sense on the same slide, but I put them there because people will interchange the terms. So the habit of a grass is what we refer to as the general growth form of a given grass. So in this drawing, we have a bunch grass. So this grass grows in a very dense grouping or a bunch. Other grasses don't grow like that, and they're more rhizomatous and will form more of a monoculture as they spread and grow. Habitat, we all know, is those environmental conditions required for a grass to survive, okay? So different than habit, and just a good reminder to have. Okay, so here are some examples of bunch grasses. Hopefully you can see the habit of those grasses to form those really dense bunches. Sometimes a grass grows in such abundance that you can't tell that it's a bunch grass. Big blue stem, a lot of people don't realize is a bunch grass because when it really gets going and establishes itself in a prairie, sometimes you can't see the individual bunches. Okay, and here are some examples of grasses that don't form those bunches and spread through rhizomes and then form more of these, you know, larger spanses, areas of the grass rather than those clusters of bunches. All right, we are wrapping up the first half of our session today on basics of grass identification, and I wanted to just go over some of the resources that I used when I was learning to identify grasses that I think may be helpful for you. So if you are in Illinois and you don't have The Vascular Flora of Illinois by Robert Mullenbrock, highly recommend. It is a technical key. There are no pictures, but it is always a great resource to have in your back pocket. I started out using more beginner-friendly guides and then got a little bit more familiar with terminology, and the Vascular Flora has been extremely, extremely helpful. In a lot of the grass descriptions, though, they do use those more technical descriptions of the spikelets. So I wouldn't recommend that as your only resource, but it can be helpful in conjunction with some others. When I was a beginner, I got the Grasses guidebook by Lauren Brown. Some of the names are a little bit outdated now, but you can look them up and see what the latest and greatest scientific name of those grasses are. But it's a really great guide that has sketches. And with grasses, sketches, rather than pictures, a lot of the times are really great when you're getting started because you can see the growth form and the structure of the grass really clearly. I have the field guide to Wisconsin grasses. I haven't used it that much. It just hasn't been one that I grab, but it is a wealth of information. So definitely recommend that you look into that one. And then I just have some websites listed as well. And these were included in the emails you got, so you don't need to worry about writing those down. If you are in Illinois, the Illinois Wildflowers website is fantastic. And I especially enjoy it for grasses because he will distinguish between grasses that look similar to that grass that he's talking about. So he'll have a description of, say, big blue stem, and then he'll say, you know, this other grass looks similar, and this is how you can tell it apart. So really, really helpful. And then the last four, not ones that I've personally used too much, but can be really helpful when you're a beginner, just to get used to some more of the terms. And there is even like a picture key that you can use and click on to go through. So I encourage you to at least explore them and see which ones work best for you. Okay, the last thing I wanted to mention is if you ever wanted to, you tried to figure out what type of grass you had, but you need some help, you're stuck. And you wanted to submit some pictures to your local extension office or to one of the many plant identification Facebook groups that are out there. Submitting good pictures and pictures of the right parts of the grass is extremely helpful. So the main key is to submit clear photos, but I've included on this slide 6 pictures that if you included all 6 will make it, somewhat likely that someone can help identify this grass. I'm not going to guarantee anything. So the first picture we'd want is of that collar region. If you can pull back the leaf blade and get a picture of the ligule, a picture of the leaf blade as much as you can, a picture of the inflorescence. Now I didn't do a great job here because I cut off the top, but a picture of the inflorescence as a whole, a close-up of the spikelets, and then a picture of the grass as a whole. Okay, if you can include all of those, it really just helps make that identification a lot easier to happen. So just wanted to put that out there. Hopefully after we've gone through this morning, now you know what parts of the grass to look for when identifying, and would hopefully then key in on those as good ones to take photos of. Okay, so we have now concluded the background on identifying grasses. So if we had any specific questions related to the first part of the session, Peggy, I'm gonna ask you and see if we've got anything that has come in.
Yeah, I think there was just a couple. You've got some grass lovers out there, but I think it's just so good information. People were pretty attentive. Teddy had asked about the dots, and someone kindly, because it was quite a ways back, that said they were glands. I assume that's what I was thinking.
Yes.
Want to double check.
Yep.
And then another person had asked about the functions of the hairs, and Caroline had added protection for one, and then desiccation to allow for drying. Anything else that you can think of that you would have said rather than those?
Yeah, no, those sound good. Yeah, just different protection for the grass depending on when the grass is emerging. If you have some early spring ones, it can just help as they're beginning their growth, if they gotta freeze. But yeah, just protection from herbivory, definitely, it's a deterrent. So It's a deterrent to me sometimes when I go up and it's, you know, turns out to be a really bristly grass instead of
Cut.
soft.
I've been sliced a lot by grasses. They definitely have a way to protect themselves. Just some, you know, there's a few things that compliments on your photos and the drawings as well. Somebody just had said, so just helping because you're looking at them so clearly and closely. So yeah, there's just some not so much questions pouring in here at the end. If they just a logistical thing, if they signed up for the first one, are they automatically signed up for all three?
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to take that off my long plate of chat here, so I knew for sure.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that I will try to cruise through all these last second things, you know, just in case. But
okay.
They feel it's being very helpful, and I'm trying to look at the chat and listen, and it's like there's a lot of good information. So just remember, folks, it will be recorded, so we don't have to worry. You'll see it again, so we can move on to your next one.
Great. And I do just want to point out, I didn't identify necessarily every grass that we looked at because most of the characteristics that I talked about, I used pictures that we'll see again. So I didn't want to necessarily have you focusing on what those characteristics are that identify those grasses, but just getting familiar with those characteristics because we will be seeing them again when we go through each of the species descriptions. So just to keep it a little bit more basic, I didn't want everyone being a little bit
Erin, real quick,
confused.
I did get a good one. Will these hold true in winter? So as they're looking at IDing next with you.
Oh, great. Not necessarily, unfortunately. So I meant to mention this before, but as the season progresses, some of these characteristics will fade. So we talked about how that membranous ligule changes color. Hairiness changes as well. So as the season progresses, you know, wear and tear on these grasses, you know, they're out in the elements, they will lose some of their hairs. So a lot of the times what I find, of course, this is not, you know, always true, but I find the leaf characteristics are more helpful before they flower. And then when they're flowering, some of those leaf characteristics may fade. Again, not on every grass, but I can think of a few specific examples where that's the case. So that's why we're not just going to look for one clue. We're going to try and find a few.
Okay. Do you want a couple more? They're pouring in, so there's a few here. Or do you want to go ahead and move on because of timing, and then I'll try to catch these up while you're doing your next one?
We can do one or two just on like ID.
Yeah. Can you help distinguish a branched, and forgive me, rachis? I noticed the co-host is not a grass specialist. Can you distinguish it from an unbranched with long stalked spikelet? Question mark. Can you distinguish?
From a rachis with, okay.
Yeah, from an unbranched rachis with long stalked spikelet. I'm not sure what, and she had sent it to me privately, but
I'm trying to think about it, and I'm trying to think of an example of a raceme that has a long stalk on it, and I can't really think of one. I guess what I would say, I mean, if you look at the picture on the screen, this is a panicle, and we can see that it's densely branched. So typically, panicles are going to have lots and lots of branches. Whereas a raceme, I don't know if I'm actually helping.
It's all right. We can.
As we go through the examples, hopefully, of the specific species, hopefully it'll clear up a little bit.
Better too, because that'll make it more clear as well. So no, I think that's great.
That's one of the hardest. The raceme is just difficult. I've struggled with that definition. So don't feel, if you feel like it's still confusing, you're pretty much in the right place for a beginner. So it's okay. And we'll hopefully clarify it as we go.
All right. Well, then let's move on to your next one.
All right. Perfect. Thank you all for the wonderful questions, and keep them coming so that Peggy has to multitask. So we're going to move on. And the first grouping of grasses that we're going to talk about is woodland grasses. Okay. So that might not be the first place that you would think you'd find a huge diversity of grasses. And of course, there's different types of woodlands, and grasses are going to be more common, in open savannas rather than in dense woods, but that's not to say that you can't find them in both of those places. So in general, the grasses that you're going to find in woodlands are adapted to at least part shade. And many of them, of course, not all of them, have developed broader leaves than grasses found in other habitats. Again, not a hard and fast rule. There are many exceptions, but we'll see that a lot of the times they do have broader leaves. Okay, so we are going to cover, I believe it's 15 woodland grasses today. And how this is going to work is we're going to have a slide of a species profile for each grass. And this is where that handout is going to match with these slides and have most of the information on that handout. Okay, so let's get started with our first grass. And our first grass is giant cane, or Arundinaria gigantea. And giant cane is a native grass that can be found in southern Illinois in bottomland forests, swamps, and along rivers. And it is a species of bamboo and the only native woody grass in our area. Okay, in the picture on the top right, hopefully you can see that stem or the culm looks like bamboo. Okay, and if you need another clue, it does have hairy ligules, and you might not be able to see in this photo the hairy ligules. I don't think I picked one that you can see. There are a few hairs here, really difficult to see in this picture. And something really cool about giant cane is it's clonal and grows in huge colonies, and it can grow for years and years and years, and it flowers once in its life and then it will die. So if you have a huge cane break, that one year, then you've had it for years, and then the next year it's gone, it's likely that it flowered and then has died. Okay, so that's giant cane. All right, our second grass is bottlebrush grass, known as Elymus hystrix. And this is the first species of ryegrass that we're going to cover. There are 10 different species in this genus in Illinois, and this is the easiest one to identify by far. It is a native grass, typically found in higher quality woods, but you can see that it's found in every county in Illinois. So keep your eyes out for this one. The leaves are not really that distinctive, unfortunately. Dark green, hairless, kind of floppy, but they do have a white membranous ligule. So in this photo over here, I just took this a week or two ago, so it's late in the season. That membranous ligule has turned brown. The characteristic that I use on this grass is the very long, straight spreading awns on the spikelets. So in this grass, we have a spike inflorescence. It resembles a bottle brush, so it holds true to that common name. And you can see that the spikelets are held out from the stem, okay? They're not oppressed or held up against the stem, they're held out. And then it has these long awns that are also held straight out, okay? The spike itself can be held straight up, but oftentimes it nods later in the season. So in this photo, you can see that it's bent. So we call that nodding. Okay, so the direction that the spikelets are facing away from the stem and the length and the direction of the awns is going to be important in distinguishing this from other ryegrasses. Okay, so this one, because it looks like a bottle brush, pretty easy to remember its common name. So that helps us out a bunch. Okay, so keeping that one in our mind, our next one is Virginia wild rye. Okay, another ryegrass, Elymus virginicus. This ryegrass is also a native species found in savannas, woods, and prairies. So it's much more common and not restricted to woodlands. So I had to make a decision on where to put each grass that we're going to talk about this week. So not all of these are just restricted to the woods. This one I found numerous times in open, sunny areas as well. The leaves, again, not really distinctive, wide, weak, shiny leaves. They have a white membranous ligule, and it also has auricles, or those are those arms that are extended out from the leaf blade and hug the stem. It's really challenging to see them. There is one auricle right here that's very small. Again, this is late in the season, so it's difficult to see it. And then the ligule is barely there, but hanging on right there, again, late in the season. Okay, the inflorescence is again a spike, but this time look at the way that the spikelets are held. They're held straight up, and they have short awns that are also held straight up. So let's look at this photo over here. We see our spikelets are not held straight out like in bottlebrush grass. They're going up, and the awns are at least 1/3 to 1/2 of the size of bottlebrush grass, and they're also held straight up, okay? This whole inflorescence, this whole spike, can either be held straight up or it can nod later in the season, okay? That's also going to be important when we talk about some of our other ryegrasses, okay? So the direction of the awns, the spikelets, and if it's nodding will all help us to distinguish these from one another. Okay, next up we have 3 grasses that I find somewhat difficult to tell apart, but I found a few characteristics that will hopefully help us out. So this first one is called nimblewill, Muhlenbergia schreiberii, and it is one of the muley grasses. And there are 14 different grasses in this genus in our state. They're also known as satin grasses, okay? So I found this grass when I was hiking, and I thought it was the next grass that we're going to look at on the next slide. And then I looked a little bit closer and realized it was something else. So this native species can be found in the woods, but also in your lawn and in disturbed areas. And that's what really clued me in that I was looking at something different. So to distinguish it from that other one, it's not rhizomatous. And you'll often find that it's rooting at the lower nodes of the grass. So if we looked at this photo over here and we looked at a node on near the base of this grass, oftentimes those nodes will reroot in the ground. So if you gently tugged on this grass, you might find that it pulls up some of those nodes that were rerooting. That's one way we can tell that this is nimblewill. Okay, the most distinctive thing about this grass is the way that the leaves are held. So you can see that these leaves are held almost straight out, and they really resemble rungs on a ladder. Okay, really distinctive growth form. And then it has a panicle. It looks like a spike, right? If we look at this inflorescence, it looks like a spike, but it's actually a panicle. And when you get up close, you'd be able to see that it does have branches on it, okay? And the spikelets are awned, okay? So the awns and the panicle is important when we compare it to the next grass, okay? You can see how small this grass is based on these pictures. So this one's gonna get about a foot and a half tall. So it is very short. But this one I have found all along the paths in the woods. And like I said, I also found it in my lawn. So it's not restricted to those woodland areas. Okay, keep this picture in your mind as I change to the next slide. And next we have another grass in the same genus. This one doesn't have a specific common name, it's just called muley grass, Muhlenbergia sobulifera. It is a little bit more restrictive in its range. So this one isn't one that you're going to find in your lawn or in more disturbed areas. It's going to be found in more woodland habitat. This one is rhizomatous, and it's not going to root at the lower nodes. So if you saw, you're trying to tell between this grass and the last grass, and you tugged on the bottom and none of the nodes were rooted, we might lean more towards muley grass, okay? We'll see that we have the same leaf description. So these leaves are also held relatively straight out like rungs on a ladder, okay? That's why I initially got confused because that leaf description is very similar. But then I saw the inflorescence, and this one has a spike with tiny round spikelets on it. Okay, so that looks very different than the last grass that had a panicle and had awned spikelets. Okay, so telling these two apart, really kind of do need that inflorescence in order to tell those two apart. But we would at least know that we had some type of muhly grass. So even if you didn't want to get as specific as the specific species, we'd at least be able to narrow it down to that genus, okay? And this one will get similar height as the last one, 1.5 feet, maybe a little bit taller, up to 2 feet. Okay, the last one that sometimes can be confused with the previous two is one called white grass. Now look, we're in a different genus here, Liersia virginica. Again, this one is native, can be found in moist to mesic woodlands and along partly shaded wetlands as well. And the best way to describe these leaves is that they're thin, wispy, and clumpy. So the picture on the top left doesn't really look that descriptive, but once you see this, I found it all over the place when I've been hiking now. And really that is a good description of how the leaves look. To get a little bit more specific, it does have hairy nodes. Okay, we can see those hairy nodes here. Also has some hairs along the stem. And then it has a spike inflorescence, and these spikelets are really interesting because they're folded in half around the stem, okay? So these are a little bit more robust than the spikelets on the last two grasses, and that folding in half around the stem is really distinctive if you can see it in person. It's really hard to see in the photo, but you would see that it encloses the stem or the rachis, not using the right term there, enclosed around the rachis, okay? All right, so those are three that looked really close to one another. Let's move to one that looks much different. Okay, so this one is poverty oak grass called Danthonia spicata. And again, a native species, much more restricted in its range or in its habitat. So it's typically found in sandy or rocky woods, on glades, and then in some prairies. So here you can hopefully see the substrate that it's growing on. It looks like it's just growing straight out of these rocks, okay? So realizing what habitat you're in can be really helpful to know that this is the grass that you're looking at. So really dry areas. The only characteristic that I need to identify this grass is the curled dead leaves, okay? You can see it's growing in a bunch, and as the leaves die, they very tightly curl. And that is the only characteristic that you'll ever need to know to identify this as poverty oak grass. It does have a panicle inflorescence with awned spikelets. I have never seen them in person and haven't ever had to get that detailed to identify this grass. So just look for the way that those leaves dry and make sure you're in the right spot. And then you should very quickly be able to tell that this is poverty oak grass. Okay. So our next one is called hairy woodland brome, Bromus pubescens. And I just added this one in, so I apologize that I have photos of it late in the fall. So not in its prime, but we can still use these characteristics that we can see to tell what we're looking at here. So this is one of the bromes, and there are 20 species in Illinois, and many of them are non-native. This one is a native species, and it's the most common native brome in Illinois. It can be found in woodlands, savanna, and floodplain areas. It is a cool season grass. So like I said, I missed it early in the year to take photos of it in its prime. Typically, it has 4 to 7 leaves along the stem that are rather green and floppy, kind of like our rye, and they curl when they dry. So hopefully in the background of this photo, you can see that curling of those leaves. The hairiness of the leaves and stem is variable. So in this specimen I found, it did have hairy leaves and a hairy stem, but that doesn't hold true for all of them. It does have a short membranous ligule and a panicle of drooping awned spikelets. Okay. There are a couple other bromes that are similar, but they have more leaves per stem. So 5 to 15 leaves per stem. So that's how you'd be able to distinguish this one from those two. Okay. And I think this is the first time I mentioned this term, cool season grass. This means that this grass is going to develop and flower early in the year, so in spring or early summer. And that's going to be compared to a warm season grass, which is going to grow and mature later in the summer and into early fall. Okay, our next grass, this is one of my absolute favorites. This is called inland oats or river oats or sea oats. There's a whole bunch of different common names, whichever type of oats you want to call it, up to your preference. I tend to call it inland oats. Casmanthium latifolium. This is, again, native, found along streams and in moist woods. It has relatively broad leaves that will taper gently as you get towards the base of the leaf blade. It does have a short ligule. And then the most distinctive part of this grass is these flattened spikelets arranged in a drooping panicle. Okay, so you can see that drooping nature of the panicle here. And we can see a side view of one of those spikelets here that's really flattened, okay? If you hold it in your hand, you can really feel how flat they are. This one has become more popular as an ornamental grass because it turns golden in the fall. It's really showy. Just watch out if you do choose to plant it because it is relatively aggressive. So just because it's native doesn't mean it isn't aggressive. It can't spread. This one is definitely one to be aware of if you do choose to plant it because of its aggressive spreading tendencies. Okay, so our next grass is foul manna grass or Glyceria striata. And this is one of the ones that I was not able to find and snap pictures of myself. But this native grass is found in wetter habitats and in every county in Illinois. So I was a little surprised I wasn't able to track it down. But it has very long, narrow leaves that are going to taper to a point, and they're held perpendicular to the stem. Unfortunately, the photos that I was able to find don't really illustrate that too clearly, but we can see some of the other characteristics like this tall white membranous ligule very clearly on this grass, and then the drooping panicle inflorescence. And we can see a close-up of the spikelets over here and how they're held, you know, on those stalks, on our branches in our panicle, okay? Okay, next up is false brome, which also has a couple other common names, bearded short husk and long-awned wood grass, okay? I learned it as false brome, so that's the one I'm gonna share with you today. Brachyelytrum erectum, again, a native grass found in higher quality dry woodlands. It has broad leaves that gradually taper at the base and at the tip of the leaf blade. And its nodes are densely covered with silky hairs. You can see that really clearly in this photo here. Those nodes have those dense silky hairs. And you can also see that they extend a little bit on the stem, and they're also present on the leaf sheath right here. It does have a panicle, and in this picture, we can see that the branches are oppressed. So that means they're held tightly upwards close to that rachis, but that's not always the form that they take. They can also be ascending or, you know, held out a little bit from that rachis. And then in the picture on the right, hopefully we can see that those spikelets have long awns on them as well. Okay, so this is going to be false brome or bearded short husk or long-awned woodgrass. I like that one as well because it really describes where you're going to find it and one of the key characteristics to identifying it. Okay, next up is wood reed or Cinna arundinacea. And this native grass can be found, again, in wetter areas, so floodplain woods, swamps, woodland openings. It's one of 2 species in its genus in Illinois, and we can see it's in nearly every county throughout the state. The leaves on this grass are going to droop near the tips, and there's a distinct membranous ligule that we can see in this photo on the right. The panicle has somewhat upward facing branches, so they're going to tend to be held up a little bit. And you can tell the species apart from the other species in the genus because the foliage is more gray-green. So if you saw this grass in the woods, again, wasn't able to get the best pictures of this one, but the leaves tend to be a little grayer and stand out a little bit from the rest of the green foliage growing around it. And the spikelets do have a barely noticeable awn. So let me see if I can point one out, maybe over here. There's a little bit of a projection. It's a very short spike-like projection that is an awn. Again, not super noticeable, but if you're trying to tell this one apart from the other in the same genus, that awn would be a clue for you. Okay, our next grass is beaked panic grass, Panicum anceps. And this is one that can be found in shady areas. It's more of an edge species, not really going to be found in the dense woods, but also can be found in open sunny areas. So I chose to stuck it in this group of plants, but really it's found in disturbed areas. Okay, so edges of trails, woodland edges, old fields, prairie restorations, you'll find this one there. It does have minutely hairy leaves, so really small hairs that you might not be able to see, but you definitely be able to feel when you were pulling that leaf blade back. The sheath on this grass is keeled. So in this case, we haven't used this term before, and it's a little bit challenging to see in this picture, but when you pull that sheath back, it will look like it's been folded in half like a piece of paper and then let to just open up. So there'd be a distinct ridge or a keel on the back of that sheath. We can see a little bit of that indentation here, but we'd really need to turn this grass around and look on the other side to see that. The leaf sheath is also hairy, so hopefully we can see some hairs in this photo here. And then it does have a panicle inflorescence, very distinct over here, with pointed spikelets. So over here we can see, I call them football shaped a lot of the time. That's where it gets its name, beaked panic grass, because of the shape of those spikelets. Not super widespread, found mostly in southern Illinois, but a few scattered counties throughout the rest of the state. And with this one, it is one of 13 species of panicums across Illinois. And it's also important to point out that there's another group of grasses referred to as panic grasses, but they've been split out into a separate genus, the Dicanthelium genus. And we'll look at those separately next. Okay, so we have just a couple grasses to go today, and they're both dicantheliums. So this one is Bosc's panic grass. Okay, so in a different genus than beaked panic grass that we just looked at. So Dicanthelium boscii. This native grass is found in rocky woods, glades, and bluffs. So it is a little bit more restricted in where it can be found. And it has relatively wide leaves that are going to just slightly clasp the stem. So what that means is at the base of the leaf blade, that blade is going to just slightly, wrap around the stem, okay, before it turns into the sheath. This grass has something called retrorsely bearded nodes, and you're probably asking me, why did I put those words in there? Retrorsely means downward facing, bearded means hairy, and we know that this is the node, okay? So this grass has nodes that have white downward facing hairs, okay? If you want to sound really fancy, you can say they have retrorsely bearded nodes. And then something that you'll find consistent across the dicantheliums is that they have panicles of round spikelets. Okay, and this one has relatively large spikelets, and if you catch it at the right time of the year, it has purple anthers. So we can see them right here. Okay, this grass is also called large fruited panic grass because it has the largest spikelets of the dicantheliums. Now, there are 33 different species of dicantheliums in Illinois, and a lot of them are really difficult to tell apart. So I included just a few this week because they are the easiest ones to pick out. Okay, and our last grass, I believe, for today is another dicanthelium, Dicanthelium laxiflorum. This one, again, doesn't have a specific common name, so we just call it panic grass. A native found in woodlands, and it's a really short bunch grass, so only gets about 6 inches tall. And I like to describe this one's leaves as being relaxed or laying on the ground. So we can see these different bunches of this grass here, over here. The leaves are really relaxed, and I describe it that way because it was taught to me that you can think of the Latin name as relaxiflorum because this grass has relaxed leaves. Just remember that that's not the actual Latin name, but that's always helped me to remember this one. It does have a hairy stem and hairy leaves as well. And then again, those small round spikelets that are in a panicle. All right. So we have made it through our first day of which grass is which. So just to review, when it comes to looking at different grass species, if the inflorescence is there, that's where you want to start. What types do you have? Is it panicle, a spike? If it's neither of those, it's probably a raceme. Do those spikelets in the inflorescence have awns? How are the awns held? How long are the awns? How many awns are there per spikelet? And then are there any distinctive colors? We didn't talk about this too much, but you know, that one grass we looked at had purple anthers on the spikelets. So that's a color that you could look for. If you don't have that inflorescence, you know, always move on to leaf characteristics. Look at that ligule first. Is there a ligule? What type of ligule is it? Are there hairs on the leaves? Where are they at? How would you characterize them? And then is there any distinctive color? We talked about one grass that's more gray-green than bright green. That may be helpful for you in distinguishing that from other species. Okay, so again, just a basic review of some things to keep in mind when you're identifying these different grasses. Okay, so looking forward, what's up next? So on Wednesday morning at 10 a.m., again, we're going to have Prairie Grass ID. We'll do a short review of how to ID grasses to start for those folks that weren't able to join us this morning. And then we'll move into identifying grasses that you'd find on the prairie or in open areas. And then on Friday, we're going to move into nuisance grass identification. So this is going to include native, non-native, and invasive species. We'll talk about those distinctions on Friday. And we've got quite a few grasses to cover on that day as well. So at this time, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me today. And Peggy, I'm going to turn it over to you and see if we have any questions to answer from the chat box.
We do, and I am moving them so I can see them all to my Word document here so I can get through as many as possible. We won't be able to get through all of them, folks. There's quite a few, but I'm going to go back to the top. Lots of thank yous and informatives, just so you know. So back to where we started. Do all perennial grasses not flower in their first year?
Do all perennial grasses not flower in their first year? I would not say that. That would depend on, I would say that's on a species specific basis. So I've had some that, you know, I've planted and they've grown and they've flowered in their first year. So
nice. John asked, do all, I'm going to mess these words up because I'm not the grass lady like you are. Do all Elymus spikelets have two awns?
Have two awns?
Yeah, do they all have two awns? The Elemis
Mm.
spike.
Great question. I do not have an answer for you. I'm not quite sure on that one.
And height and growth habit of Virginia wild rye. I think I had asked that because it just said height and growth habit. And I was trying to keep up with photos and questions.
Yeah, so Virginia wild rye, I have seen anywhere from 2 feet to up to 4 feet tall, depending on where it's growing. And I don't believe it's a bunch grass. So
What about, is it better to burn grasses in the summer or the fall?
depends on what grass species you have. So that's a complicated question. Depends on what your management goals are. A lot of the times, a good way to distinguish them is if they're cool season or warm season grasses. And then depending on which you want to promote or knock back, you can burn in different seasons to do that. But again, that's a little complicated to give just one simple answer to.
Of course, and where you live and all the people that are
Exactly.
here where you live. Martha had a question about where to submit pictures. Martha, if you look at the slide right now with Erin's face, her email is right there. So
my inbox is going to be flooded with grass pictures.
You may not, there's too many, she won't get to you all, but Martha was specifically must have one in mind, I think.
Yeah, so you're welcome to send pictures to me. You're welcome to bring them to your local extension office. You can look on Facebook as well. I'm not going to necessarily name specific groups, but you can search for different plant identification groups as well.
Kim asked if nimbleweed, is nimbleweed more fine-leaved than the mullygrass?
So it looked like it in the photos, but I have seen them both have similar width of leaves and fineness of leaves.
They're in, right?
Yeah, in the early stages of their growth, they look very similar. So I would honestly wait for the inflorescence on that species to be able to tell them apart.
Karen asks what the best way would be to distinguish the different species of Elemis. What's the best way?
So for those, and there's going to be at least one, maybe two more that we'll cover this week. What I use is how the spikelets are held. Are they held oppressed or facing upwards on the stem? Are they held out? How are the awns held? Are the awns held straight out from the stem or held up? There's one species we haven't talked about yet that the awns will curve. And then how the inflorescence is held. Is it held erect or straight up? Does it nod? The ones we talked about today can be either. The other species we're going to talk about, it always nods. So that's a really good key to look for. So piecing them together, there's not just one characteristic, you have to look at a few, but piecing those together, at least for the species we cover, there are some others out there. I don't know how to identify all, I believe 10 in the genus, but the ones that I do, that's the characteristics that I've used.
Interesting. Can you define cool or warm season grasses?
Yes. So again, cool season grasses are those that are going to flower in spring or early summer. Warm season are going to flower in summer or early fall.
Do all the Muhlenbergia species, does that make sense to you?
Yes.
have tiny, do all of them have tiny white specks along the veins?
Ooh, great question. I do not know. I only know two of them, 2 or 3 or 4, a couple of those 14 species. Yeah, that in depth, I'm not sure.
But some of them do that Is that what you had? I missed that one.
I don't think I identified that. They may have picked it out in a picture and been asking about it. Yeah.
Cool. Let's see. Oh, you answered that one after I wrote how many panic grasses in Illinois. It was 30 something. I remember that.
33 dicantheliums. So that's one type of panic grass. 14 of the panicums.
I'm trying to read through, get through. There's another one down here. What is the anther?
Oh, the anther is going to be, yeah, we didn't talk about that. That's one of the male parts of the flower that you can find in the spikelet. So when the grasses are flowering, they'll exert or push out their anthers.
Is there a way, this is one of our last big ones. Folks, there's a lot of questions and I'm not going to be able to get to all of the new ones that I didn't pull over yet. Is there a way to tell if grass is in the genus Panicum versus Dicanthyllium before moving to species? Genus, from the genus.
Oh, I'm sure if you had a technical key that there is a characteristic that they use to parse them out. I don't know off the top of my head what that characteristic is.
Yeah, I went to school when Molenbrock was there and we had to use that book. Oh my goodness. There's a lot there.
It's not, yeah, it's not necessarily where you want to start, but it's good to have in your back pocket. For sure.
You know, here's a question. It's a broad question, but it's something. Oops, and it just moved. But I've been trying to find a good Latin dictionary. John asked, can you recommend a dictionary for learning correct pronunciation of terms and species? I'm assuming it'd be a Latin dictionary or a Latin. I can't found a good one yet.
I haven't either. And honestly, what I was taught is there are some general rules, I will say, that you should follow. But what I've always been taught is if you pronounce it with confidence, no one's going to question what you're saying.
Right.
And there are some, there are prominent botanists that will be, meeting with one another and they pronounce it differently, but they both know what they're talking about. So that's okay. So I am not saying that I'm pronouncing these correctly at all. But if you just try to break it down and sound out each part, typically that works.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's intimidating. It really is, but just say it with gusto and,
In my own wildlife world, I just add it with a French accent and everybody's just stunned, so they don't ask. I do have one question that would be interesting. I'm trying to go through them all, folks. Does nimbleweed have a particular wildlife insect value? I was led to believe it was a lawn weed needing to be eradicated. I didn't know it was native.
Right. I'm not sure off the top of my head. I would check the Illinois Wildflowers website because he does have information on faunal associations. But yeah, I was very surprised as well because again, I thought I was looking at just regular muley grass, and then I went, oh, it's got awns, that looks wrong. And then I found it hiking, and then I found it, right next in the backyard of my office.
And don't you agree that when they're in their proper community, they do what they're supposed to do and match up to the books, but when they're in a different community, it can be, they can be a little more aggressive, or they can do different things.
Definitely. I found it where I found a huge section of it was actually in a power line clearance when I was hiking in the woods. And the trail went across a cleared area and it was just chock full of it. And that's when I realized, okay, I definitely got something different than what I thought it was. And started looking a little bit closer at it. But I'm sure, there's something out there that uses it. But yeah, again, it depends on where it's growing. If it's in, your lawn and you don't want it there, then,
right.
It depends on where it's growing as well. So
awesome. Folks, I would love to read all of these and I cannot, but I'm so appreciative that you've given Erin your attention, that you've stayed on for the whole session. I hope you're as intrigued as I am, and plan to be back here on Wednesday. We are at our time of 11:30, and I would like to say thank you so much to Erin for this, and it's a whole nother world now for me. So now I have to go out and try to figure these things out. So thanks, folks. Also, I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat, some people have been asking about different resources, And these will be some of the things that you would be possibly interested in. So I'm just going to drop these in the chat real quick, and we'll try to give you time to copy those and move them to a new location. And let me move this to everybody. This is fun, but there's just so many. All right, here we go. We'll get those in there for you, and you could pick up on some of those as well as the suggestions from others that are coming in.
All right, great. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate having you on here and hope to see you all Wednesday and Friday. So take care until then, start identifying grasses, and we'll meet back in a couple days.
Awesome. Thanks, folks.